The flashing red and blue lights cut through the heavy Virginia rain, reflecting off the polished chrome of the vintage 1968 Mercedes-Benz. Behind the wheel sat a 72-year-old man, his hands resting at 10 and 2, his breathing perfectly measured. He had spent his entire life studying the law, dismantling injustices, and wearing the heavy black robes of the highest court in the land. But to the aggressive, heavy-stepping patrolman approaching his window, with a hand resting casually on his holstered firearm, the elderly man was just another target. The officer thought he was about to make an easy intimidation stop. He had no idea he had just pulled over the architect of his own impending professional destruction. The asphalt of US Route 29 was slick with a sudden, driving autumn downpour. It was nearly midnight in Fauquier County, a stretch of Virginia, where the suburban sprawl of Washington, D.C. surrendered to rural timberland and long, isolated stretches of highway. Harrison Sterling drove in silence, the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers providing the only soundtrack. At 72, Harrison was a man carved from patience and intellect. He wore a simple, tailored charcoal sweater over a crisp white collar. His silver hair was neatly cropped, framing a face lined with decades of reading dense legal briefs and making decisions that altered the course of American history. He was returning from a quiet weekend in Charlottesville, heading back to his residence in the capital. He drove a pristine, silver 1968 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL, a retirement gift to himself, bought and restored with meticulous care. 2 miles behind him, hidden in the shadows of an unlit highway overpass, sat Officer Derek Cobb. Cobb was a 12-year veteran of the county force, a man whose personnel file was a thick ledger of civilian complaints, excessive force allegations, and racial profiling accusations that had miraculously been buried by a sympathetic union representative. Cobb viewed his patrol sector not as a community to protect, but as a hunting ground. He possessed a deeply ingrained, toxic worldview that dictated who belonged in certain neighborhoods and who had the right to drive certain cars. As the silver Mercedes glided past the overpass, traveling exactly at the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour, Cobb's radar gun remained silent. There was no traffic violation. There was no erratic driving. But as the Mercedes passed beneath the ambient glow of a lone street lamp, Cobb caught a glimpse of the driver's profile. An elderly black man. Cobb sneered, tossing his half-empty coffee cup onto the passenger-side floorboard. He shifted his cruiser into drive and pulled out onto the highway, his headlights off, until he was within 100 yards of the vintage car. Probably a stolen classic, Cobb thought to himself, his mind immediately leaping to the worst, most biased conclusion. Or some low-level dealer who got lucky. He didn't run the plates yet. He didn't want the dispatcher asking questions about his probable cause. He wanted to rattle the driver first. Harrison saw the aggressive approach in his rear-view mirror. The patrol car was tailgating him, riding mere inches from his rear bumper. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly, but his heart rate remained steady. He had grown up in the Jim Crow South. He had survived the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He knew exactly what was happening. It was a tragic, infuriating reality that a lifetime of monumental achievement could still be momentarily eclipsed by the color of his skin in the eyes of a prejudiced stranger. Suddenly, the cruiser's light bar erupted in a blinding display of red and blue. The siren let out a short, piercing wail. Harrison calmly engaged his right turn signal, smoothly decelerated, and pulled the Mercedes onto the gravel shoulder, ensuring he left enough room for the officer to stand safely away from the active traffic lane. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, turned on the interior cabin light, and placed both of his hands flat on the top of the steering wheel. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not reach for the glove compartment. He simply waited. Behind him, Cobb threw his cruiser into park, unclipped the retention strap on his duty holster, and stepped out into the rain. He left his high beams and spotlight on, aiming them directly into the Mercedes's rearview mirror to blind the driver, a standard intimidation tactic. As Cobb marched toward the driver's side door, his heavy boots crunching against the wet gravel, he prepared his script. He was ready to demand obedience, to assert dominance. He was entirely unprepared for the man waiting for him inside. Cobb stopped just behind the driver's side door pillar, keeping his body angled and his right hand hovering near his firearm. He shined his heavy maglite directly through the wet glass, striking Harrison squarely in the eyes. Harrison did not flinch. He slowly turned his head, squinting through the glare, and looked at the officer. "Roll it down, all the way," Cobb barked, his voice dripping with unwarranted hostility. Harrison reached down with his left hand, slowly and deliberately, and rolled the window down. The cold, damp air rushed into the warm cabin, carrying the smell of wet pine and exhaust. "License and registration," Cobb demanded, not offering a greeting, not stating a reason for the stop. "Good evening, officer," Harrison said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded courtrooms and silenced squabbling senators. "May I ask why I am being pulled over this evening?" Cobb leaned closer, the beam of his flashlight dropping to illuminate the luxurious leather interior of the classic car. "I didn't ask for a conversation, boy," Cobb sneered, purposefully using the archaic, deeply offensive slur to establish his perceived hierarchy. "I asked for your papers. Whose car is this? You joyriding in your boss's vehicle?" Harrison's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. The word boy hung in the air, a grotesque echo of a bygone era. For a fraction of a second, the Supreme Court Justice felt a surge of raw, human anger. But Harrison was a master of restraint. He knew that reacting with anger was exactly what Cobb wanted. It would provide the flimsy justification the officer needed to escalate the situation physically. "The vehicle belongs to me, officer," Harrison replied calmly, his enunciation perfect. "My wallet is in my left interior coat pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for my wallet now. Is that acceptable?" Cobb scoffed, visibly irritated by the driver's articulate, unafraid demeanor. "Just get the damn license, and move slow." Harrison slowly unzipped his jacket, retrieved a slim leather wallet, and extracted his Virginia driver's license. He handed it through the window. It read, Harrison D. Sterling. It did not list his occupation. Cobb snatched the plastic card. He shined his light on the ID, then back at Harrison's face. "Harrison, huh? Well, Harrison, you were swerving back there, crossing the yellow line." "That is factually incorrect, officer," Harrison stated, his tone flat and unwavering. "I have maintained a straight trajectory and a constant speed of 55 miles per hour since leaving the city limits." "Are you calling me a liar?" Cobb's voice spiked in volume. He stepped closer, leaning his face into the window opening. "You want me to drag you out of this car and show you what happens to people who call me a liar?" "I am stating a fact for the record," Harrison replied, maintaining eye contact. Furious that his intimidation tactics were failing against an elderly man, Cobb marched back to his cruiser. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed his hand onto his mobile data terminal, MDT. He typed in Harrison's license number, desperately hoping for an outstanding warrant, a suspended license, a history of drug charges, anything he could use to ruin this man's night. He hit enter. The screen loaded for 3 seconds. Then the MDT screen flashed with a solid red banner. "Restricted file. Clearance level 1 required." Subject: Sterling. Harrison D. Do not detain. Federal protection. Status active. Contact. U.S. Marshals Service immediately upon encounter. Cobb stared at the screen. He blinked hard, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He read the text again. Federal protection status? A smarter, more rational officer would have immediately realized he had stepped into a minefield. A logical cop would have returned to the Mercedes, apologized profusely, and let the man go. But Cobb was not a logical man. He was driven by ego and prejudice. System error, Cobb rationalized to himself, his bias overriding basic police protocol. Or it's a fake ID tied to a stolen identity. That's it. This old man stole the identity of some federal informant or something. The idea that the black man in the classic car was actually someone of profound importance was literally incomprehensible to Cobb's narrow mind. He decided to double down. If this guy was using a stolen federal identity, Cobb was going to make the bust of his career. Cobb grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got a suspect on Route 29. Refusing commands, acting suspicious. I'm going to initiate a vehicle search. Send backup, non-emergency." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his flashlight and walked back to the Mercedes, his hand unsnapping his holster once again. The trap was set, but Cobb didn't realize he was the one walking into it. Cobb approached the window, his posture radiating aggression. He slapped his open palm against the roof of the pristine Mercedes, a loud, metallic smack that made Harrison finally clench his jaw. "Step out of the vehicle," Cobb ordered. "Now." "Officer," Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying weight of absolute authority. "I strongly advise you to reconsider your current course of action. You lack probable cause for a traffic stop, let alone an extraction." "I said step out," Cobb yelled, pulling his baton from his belt with his left hand, "or I will break this window and drag you through it." Harrison took a deep breath. He knew the law perfectly, but he also knew the grim statistics of traffic stops on lonely roads. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "I am stepping out of the vehicle. My hands will remain visible." Harrison opened the door and stood up. Even at 72, he stood 6 feet tall. His posture was ramrod straight. Standing in the rain, illuminated by the flashing lights, Harrison projected an aura of profound dignity that starkly contrasted with Cobb's trembling, rage-fueled stance. "Face the car, hands on the roof," Cobb barked. Harrison complied, placing his palms flat on the cold, wet roof of his car. Cobb immediately stepped in, kicking Harrison's legs apart roughly. He conducted a harsh, invasive pat-down, finding nothing but keys and a handkerchief. "Stand there, don't move," Cobb ordered. Without asking for consent, Cobb leaned into the Mercedes. He began tearing through the interior. He ripped the registration from the glove box, tossing napkins and maintenance receipts onto the floor mats. He checked beneath the seats. Then, he reached into the back and grabbed Harrison's leather briefcase. "Officer, that briefcase contains privileged documents," Harrison warned from outside the car, his voice slicing through the sound of the rain. "You do not have a warrant, nor do you have consent to search my property." "Shut up!" Cobb yelled from inside the car. He hauled the heavy briefcase onto the passenger seat and popped the brass latches. Inside, there were no drugs. There were no weapons. There was only paper. Thick, bound stacks of paper. Cobb grabbed the top file. He shined his flashlight on it. It was heavily redacted, but the header was printed in bold, unmistakable lettering. Supreme Court of the United States. Chambers of Justice. Harrison D. Sterling. Draft opinion. Fourth Amendment. Violations in rural jurisdictions. Cobb froze. His breath hitched in his throat. He stared at the name. Sterling. Harrison D. He looked over his shoulder, through the rain-streaked window, at the elderly man standing patiently with his hands on the roof of the car. No, Cobb thought, a cold spike of panic piercing his stomach. No, that's impossible. It's a prop. It's a fake. His hands trembling slightly, Cobb dug deeper into the briefcase. Beneath a copy of the Constitution and a fountain pen case, he found a small, heavy leather wallet. He flipped it open. A solid gold badge gleamed under the harsh beam of the maglight. It bore the Great Seal of the United States. Next to the badge was a federal identification card. It featured a crisp photograph of the man standing outside. Below the photograph it read, Harrison D. Sterling, Associate, Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. The silence inside the car was deafening, save for the patter of rain on the roof. The world seemed to stop spinning. The realization crashed down upon Cobb with the force of a falling anvil. The man he had just called boy, the man he had just threatened to drag through a window, the man whose constitutional rights he had just flagrantly violated on the side of a highway, was one of the 9 most powerful jurists in the country. Even worse, as Cobb stared at the legal brief on the passenger seat, Fourth Amendment violations in rural jurisdictions, he realized Justice Sterling literally wrote the legal doctrine on unlawful police searches. Cobb slowly backed out of the car. The baton felt incredibly heavy in his left hand. His throat was completely dry. He stood up, turning to face Justice Sterling. Sterling slowly lowered his hands from the roof of the car. He turned to face the terrified officer. The Supreme Court Justice did not look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. Officer Cobb, Justice Sterling said calmly, reading the name tag on the man's chest. I believe you have found my identification. Cobb opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His arrogant sneer had completely vanished, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed look of a man who has just stepped off a cliff and is waiting to hit the ground. Now, Justice Sterling continued, stepping away from the car, his presence suddenly overwhelming the space between them. Let us have a discussion about probable cause, the Fourth Amendment, and the severe consequences of operating under the color of law. The rain continued to lash against the asphalt of U.S. Route 29, but Officer Derek Cobb could no longer feel the cold. A sickening, profound heat had flooded his chest, radiating outward and turning his limbs to lead. He stood paralyzed beside the open passenger door of the 1968 Mercedes-Benz, the gold federal badge of an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, trembling violently in his hand. Justice Harrison Sterling remained completely motionless. He did not cross his arms. He did not smile. He simply watched the realization dismantle the arrogant patrolman, piece by piece. Sir, Justice Sterling, Cobb stammered, the racial slurs and authoritative bark entirely stripped from his vocabulary. His voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic over the hum of the cruiser's engine. I was unaware. Your plates, the system. My license plates are standard Virginia historical tags, Officer Cobb, Justice Sterling replied, his voice a steady, unyielding instrument. However, the federal protection flag attached to my operator's license is entirely standard for a member of the High Court, a flag you chose to ignore, or worse, fundamentally misunderstood. Cobb swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. He took a stumbling step forward, extending a shaky hand to return the leather wallet and badge. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, Your Honor. The rain, the darkness. I thought you were swerving. For your own safety, I had to be sure. Do not insult my intelligence, and do not perjure yourself on the side of this highway, Sterling said sharply, the words cracking like a whip. You initiated a traffic stop without probable cause. You ordered me from my vehicle under threat of physical violence. You conducted an illegal search of my person. You then proceeded to execute a warrantless search of my vehicle and my privileged, federally protected documents. You did not do this out of a concern for public safety. You did this because of a grotesque, antiquated prejudice. Before Cobb could attempt another desperate lie, the wail of a secondary siren pierced the night. 2 miles back, when Cobb had keyed his radio to request non-emergency backup, he had unknowingly triggered a much larger response. The dispatcher, seeing the red, restricted file, federal protection banner that Cobb had foolishly ignored, had immediately contacted the Virginia State Police and the regional office of the United States Marshals Service. Headlights cut through the downpour as a heavy Virginia State Police SUV tore onto the gravel shoulder, followed closely by a black, unmarked Chevrolet Tahoe. Sergeant William Brentwood of the State Police threw his door open before his SUV had even fully stopped. Brentwood was a 20-year veteran, a man who played strictly by the book. As he sprinted through the rain, his hand resting securely on his duty belt, he took in the scene. Cobb, looking like a ghost, holding a wallet, and an elderly black man standing calmly in the rain. Then, Brentwood recognized the man. He had seen Justice Sterling's face on the news, in legal journals, and in federal briefings. "Cobb, what the hell are you doing?" Sergeant Brentwood roared over the storm, stepping between the patrolman and the justice. "Sarge, I pulled him over for erratic driving," Cobb lied, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes darting to the unmarked Tahoe that had just parked behind the cruiser. 2 men in dark windbreakers emblazoned with U.S. Marshal in bold yellow letters stepped out of the Tahoe. They did not look pleased. "Justice Sterling, sir," one of the marshals said, approaching rapidly and purposefully, ignoring Cobb entirely. "Are you injured? Has this officer harmed you?" "I am physically unharmed, Deputy," Sterling replied smoothly, nodding to the federal agent. "Though my Fourth Amendment rights have been severely bruised, and my vehicle has been unlawfully ransacked." Sergeant Brentwood turned slowly to look at Cobb. The sergeant's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You searched a Supreme Court justice's vehicle without a warrant?" I smelled marijuana, Sarge," Cobb blurted out, a desperate, reflexive lie born of years of corrupt habit. It was the ultimate, cowardly defense of a dirty cop. Justice Sterling finally smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "Officer Cobb, I am a 72-year-old federal judge returning from a guest lecture at the University of Virginia School of Law. I do not smoke. I do not drink. But your insistence on adding a fabricated narcotic allegation to your expanding list of civil rights violations will make the impending federal inquiry incredibly robust." Sergeant Brentwood stepped forward, invading Cobb's personal space. "Hand me your weapon, Derek." "What?" "Sarge, come on, it's just a mistake." "I said hand me your weapon," Brentwood ordered, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "And your badge. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs and federal investigation." Under the unforgiving glare of the flashing lights, watched by a Supreme Court justice and 2 U.S. Marshals, Cobb slowly unbuckled his gun belt. The metallic clatter of his firearm being handed over sounded like a prison door slamming shut. The predator of Route 29 had just been entirely disarmed and publicly humiliated, but the true nightmare for Derek Cobb was only just beginning. 4 months later, the damp chill of the Virginia highway had been replaced by the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned environment of the Albert Phil Bryan United States Courthouse in Alexandria. The courtroom was packed, the heavy oak pews filled with legal scholars, journalists, and civil rights advocates. The air was thick with anticipation. This was not a standard disciplinary hearing. This was a high-stakes federal civil rights trial. Derek Cobb sat at the defense table, wearing a poorly tailored grey suit that seemed to swallow him. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the nervous, twitching energy of a cornered animal. Beside him sat Thomas Decker, a seasoned union attorney who was currently wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Decker had spent his career making excessive force complaints disappear, but he knew he was entirely out of his depth today. At the prosecution table sat the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Richard Callahan. Callahan was a legal shark, meticulously preparing to tear Cobb's defense to shreds. But the most intimidating presence in the room was not the prosecutor, nor was it the presiding federal judge, Honorable David L. Prescott. The most terrifying presence for Cobb was the man sitting quietly in the front row of the gallery, Justice Harrison Sterling. Sterling wore a sharp navy suit, his demeanor as calm and analytical as ever. He was not there to testify today. His sworn deposition had already been entered into the record, a masterpiece of legal clarity that dismantled Cobb's actions second by second. Sterling was simply there to observe the wheels of justice turn. "Mr. Decker," Judge Prescott stated, peering over his reading glasses, "your client is facing federal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You have submitted a motion to dismiss, claiming Officer Cobb acted in good faith and is protected by qualified immunity." Decker stood up, clearing his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Officer Cobb believed he witnessed a traffic violation. In the dark, in the rain, mistakes are made. Furthermore, he believed he had probable cause to search the vehicle based on a perceived odor. The defense argues that this falls under the standard protections afforded to law enforcement officers making split-second decisions." "Split-second decisions?" Prosecutor Callahan interrupted, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, this was not a split-second decision. This was a methodical, protracted exercise in racial profiling and intimidation." "Objection!" Decker shouted. "Prosecution is characterizing my client's internal motives without proof." Callahan turned toward the defense table, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Proof, Your Honor. The defense has built their entire case on the assumption that it is Officer Cobb's word against the victims. They have relied heavily on the fact that Officer Cobb's dash cam mysteriously malfunctioned 2 minutes prior to the stop, and his body cam battery died." Cobb sank lower in his chair. It was a classic, dirty maneuver. No footage meant reasonable doubt. "However," Callahan continued, projecting his voice so every journalist in the room could hear, "Justice Sterling drives a remarkably well-restored 1968 Mercedes-Benz, a vehicle so valuable and its owner so prominent that his security detail insisted on aftermarket modifications." Callahan pressed a button on a remote on his desk. A large television monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. "Your Honor, I present Prosecution Exhibit F," Callahan announced. "High-definition, 360-degree infrared audio and video recordings, captured by the hidden, hardwired security system integrated into Justice Sterling's vehicle. Footage that automatically uploads to a secure federal cloud server." The color drained entirely from Cobb's face. He let out a low, strangled gasp. Decker, the union lawyer, closed his eyes and dropped his pen onto the table. The screen played the encounter with terrifying clarity. The entire courtroom watched as Cobb's cruiser aggressively tailgated the perfectly straight-driving Mercedes. They heard the crystal-clear audio of Cobb approaching the window. "I didn't ask for a conversation, boy. I asked for your papers." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The racial slur hung in the pristine air of the federal courtroom, an ugly, undeniable testament to Cobb's true motives. They watched Cobb threaten violence. They watched him tear through the vehicle without consent. They heard him fabricate the claim of smelling marijuana after Sergeant Brentwood arrived. effectively proving perjury. Judge Prescott stared at the screen, his expression hardening into stone. He looked down at Cobb, who was now staring at his own trembling hands, his career and freedom evaporating before his eyes. "Mr. Decker," Judge Prescott said, his voice cold enough to freeze water, "I strongly suggest you withdraw your motion regarding qualified immunity, unless you would like me to sanction you for presenting frivolous arguments in the face of insurmountable, indisputable evidence." "Motion withdrawn, Your Honor," Decker whispered, defeated. In the front row, Justice Sterling simply adjusted his cuffs. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. The hard karma was not a matter of revenge. It was a matter of mathematics. Cobb had subtracted justice from the world for years, and now the universe was aggressively balancing the equation. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. On the large monitor, the video of Officer Derek Cobb's disastrous traffic stop had finished playing, leaving a frozen frame of Cobb's face twisted in an ugly, prejudiced sneer. At the defense table, Attorney Thomas Decker looked as though he had swallowed a stone. He slowly packed his legal pads into his briefcase. He knew there was no cross-examination that could undo the damage of high-definition, unblinking video evidence. "Your Honor," Decker rasped, standing up with none of his usual bluster. "The defense acknowledges the severity of the footage. However, we ask the court to consider Officer Cobb's 12 years of service. We maintain this was an isolated lapse in judgment, a tragic deviation brought on by the immense stress of rural highway patrol. We plead for leniency, based on a previously unblemished official record." United States Attorney Richard Callahan did not sit down. Instead, he slowly buttoned his suit jacket, a predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. This was the moment he had built his entire prosecution toward. The trap was about to spring shut, sealing Cobb's fate with titanium bars. "An isolated lapse in judgment, Mr. Decker?" Callahan's voice boomed across the courtroom, rich with righteous indignation. "An unblemished official record. Your Honor, if it pleases the court, the prosecution would like to call our next witness. The government calls former United States Marine Corps Corporal David Garrison to the stand." Cobb's head snapped up. The color that had briefly returned to his face vanished instantly, leaving a sickly, ashen gray. His hands began to tremble so violently they rattled against the polished oak table. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A young man in his late 20s walked down the center aisle. He walked with a pronounced limp, leaning heavily on a cane, wearing a neatly pressed civilian suit. He took the stand, swore on the Bible, and looked directly at Derek Cobb. The young veteran's eyes burned with a cold, unyielding fire. "Corporal Garrison," Callahan began, stepping out from behind his podium, "could you please tell the court where you were on the night of October 14th, 3 years ago?" "I was driving home on US Route 29, sir," Garrison replied, his voice steady. "I had just returned stateside from a deployment in Helmand Province. I was medically discharged due to an IED blast. I was driving my late father's pickup truck." "And what happened on that highway, Corporal?" "I was pulled over by Officer Derek Cobb," Garrison said, pointing a steady finger at the defense table. "He claimed my tail light was out. It wasn't. I told him I was a veteran and reached for my wallet to show my ID. He pulled his weapon, dragged me out of my truck by my injured leg, and threw me onto the asphalt." A murmur rippled through the gallery. In the front row, Justice Harrison Sterling leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the young veteran. "Did he search your vehicle, Corporal?" Callahan asked softly. "Yes, sir. Without my consent. And when he found nothing, he miraculously discovered a small plastic bag of methamphetamine tucked behind my passenger seat. Garrison's jaw tightened. I have never touched a drug in my life, but I was arrested. I lost my VA benefits. I lost my housing. It took me 2 years and every dime I had to clear my name of the felony charge. But the arrest record ruined my civilian career prospects. Cobb was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. "He's lying," Cobb hissed to Decker. But the lawyer physically recoiled from his own client, refusing to make eye contact. "Your Honor," Callahan said, turning back to the judge. When the Department of Justice initiated the civil rights probe into Officer Cobb following his encounter with Justice Sterling, we didn't just look at that single night. We subpoenaed the GPS logs of his cruiser. We cross-referenced them with every arrest report he filed over the last decade. We found a staggering, undeniable statistical anomaly. Callahan retrieved a thick, bound ledger from his table and dropped it onto the evidence podium with a resounding thud. Officer Cobb did not have an unblemished record. He had a meticulously buried one, Callahan declared. We have identified 42 separate incidents over the last 10 years where Officer Cobb initiated traffic stops on minority drivers, veterans, and out-of-state motorists without probable cause. In 20 of those cases, narcotics were discovered during illegal searches. We have secured sworn affidavits from 12 other victims, including Corporal Garrison, who are prepared to testify that Officer Cobb planted evidence, falsified police reports, and engaged in systematic intimidation. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and furious whispers. Judge Prescott hammered his gavel, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots until silence was restored. "This is not a case of a stressed officer making a mistake," Callahan concluded, staring directly into Cobb's terrified eyes. "This is a case of a predator wearing a badge, a man who used the color of law to terrorize the vulnerable, confident that the system would always take his word over theirs. He operated with absolute impunity until the night his arrogance blinded him, and he pulled over the one man who possessed the power, the knowledge, and the undeniable proof to dismantle his reign of terror." Cobb looked toward the front row. Justice Sterling was looking back at him. The justice's expression was not triumphant. It was the chilling, immovable face of true justice. The avalanche had hit, and Derek Cobb was entirely buried beneath the weight of his own sins. The heavy mahogany doors of the Albert V. Bryan United States Courthouse in Alexandria remained firmly closed for exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes. For the seasoned federal prosecutors, the short deliberation time signaled an absolute bloodbath for the defense. For former Officer Derek Cobb, every tick of the brass wall clock echoed like a judge's gavel, striking the inside of his skull. When the bailiff finally announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the atmosphere in the packed courtroom shifted from tense anticipation to a suffocating, breathless vacuum. Cobb stood at the defense table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the oak wood. His attorney, Thomas Decker, stood beside him, maintaining a rigid, professional distance, fully aware that he was standing next to a sinking ship. Judge David L. Prescott took his seat upon the elevated bench, his face an unreadable mask of judicial stoicism. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. The foreperson, a stern-faced school administrator named Margaret Higgins, stood up in the first row of the jury box. She held a stack of paper that seemed incredibly heavy in her trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor. The defendant will face the jury," Judge Prescott ordered. Cobb turned. He could barely breathe. The air felt thick, humid, and entirely devoid of oxygen. He looked into the eyes of the 12 men and women who held his life in their hands. Not a single one of them would meet his gaze. They looked at the floor, at the judge, at the prosecution table. anywhere but at the disgraced man in the ill-fitting grey suit. On the first count of the indictment, the clerk read aloud, her voice crisp and formal, deprivation of rights under colour of law, in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, concerning the victim, Harrison D. Sterling. How do you find? Guilty, foreperson Higgins stated clearly. Cobb flinched, as if he had been physically struck. On the second count, the clerk continued, deprivation of rights under colour of law, concerning the victim, David Garrison. How do you find? Guilty. The word repeated, a rhythmic, merciless drumbeat of condemnation. On the third count, deprivation of rights under colour of law, concerning the victim, Sarah Miller. Guilty. Concerning the victim, Michael Patterson. Guilty. For 20 excruciating minutes, the clerk read through the sprawling 42-count federal indictment. Count after count of civil rights violations, illegal search and seizures, falsification of official police records, perjury, and witness tampering. And for every single count, the answer from the jury box was a resounding, unwavering, guilty. By the time the clerk reached the final charge of obstruction of justice, Cobb's knees had buckled entirely. He was practically hanging from the edge of the defense table, his chest heaving with dry, panicked sobs. The arrogant predator who had stalked the dark stretches of U.S. Route 29, terrorizing those he deemed beneath him, had been completely eradicated, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal facing the absolute ruin of his existence. The jury is thanked and excused, Judge Prescott said, striking his gavel. Sentencing will commence immediately following the victim impact statements. The courtroom did not empty. The gallery remained packed, the silence broken only by the scratching of reporters' pens and the muffled weeping of Cobb's estranged sister in the second row. United States Attorney Richard Callahan stood and approached the podium. Your Honor, the government calls David Garrison. The young Marine veteran, relying heavily on his cane, made his way to the center of the room. He did not look at the jury this time. He looked directly at Derek Cobb. When you pulled me over, Garrison began, his voice echoing with raw, unprocessed trauma. You didn't just take my freedom for a night. You took my dignity. You took the honor I bled for in Helmand Province. Because of the felony drug charge you fabricated and planted in my truck, the Veterans Administration suspended my disability benefits. I lost my apartment. My fiancée left me because she couldn't handle the legal bills and the public disgrace. I spent 2 years sleeping in a friend's unheated garage, fighting a system that you manipulated. You broke my life into pieces, Officer Cobb. And you did it with a smile on your face. Garrison stepped down, making way for a young, exhausted-looking woman. Sarah Miller was a pediatric nurse who had been driving home from a late-night hospital shift when Cobb targeted her. He pulled me over and said my license plate light was dim, Sarah told the court, tears streaming down her face. He searched my purse without asking. He found $4,000 in cash, money I had just withdrawn to pay for my mother's funeral expenses. He confiscated it under civil asset forfeiture, claiming a police dog smelled narcotics on the bills. There were no narcotics. There was no dog. He just took it. He told me if I tried to fight him in court, he would call Child Protective Services and have my daughter taken away. He is a monster who used a badge to steal from a grieving woman. Victim after victim stepped forward. A traveling salesman who was beaten on the side of the highway. A college student whose car was illegally impounded, causing him to lose his academic scholarship. The sheer volume of human suffering that Cobb had casually inflicted was staggering. It painted a picture not of a flawed law enforcement officer, but of a methodical, sadistic criminal, operating a localized extortion racket under the protective umbrella of municipal immunity. Finally, the statements concluded. Judge Prescott adjusted his heavy black robes and leaned forward, his eyes boring into Cobb. "Derek Cobb, stand up," the judge ordered. Decker had to grab Cobb by the elbow and physically haul him to his feet. "In my 25 years on the federal bench, I have presided over cases involving cartel enforcers, organized crime syndicates, and violent extremists," Judge Prescott began, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet rumble. "But the crimes you have committed offend the very foundation of this republic in a way that those others do not. You were granted the awesome, terrifying power of the state. You were given a badge, a firearm, and the trust of the public. You weaponized that trust to feed your own bigotry and greed." Cobb opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, but his throat was completely dry. No sound emerged. "You believed that because your victims were poor, or because they were minorities, or because they were alone on a dark road, that they had no voice," Judge Prescott continued. "You believed the shield of qualified immunity made you an untouchable god in your patrol sector. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You pulled over the one man who possessed the profound legal architecture to tear your protective shield to shreds." Judge Prescott opened the heavy sentencing binder on his desk. "For the deprivation of civil rights under the color of law, for the systemic corruption of official proceedings, and for the intentional infliction of untold suffering upon the citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia, it is the judgment of this court that you, Derek Cobb, be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 240 months. 20 years. To be served consecutively, without the possibility of early parole." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. 20 years in the federal system for a disgraced cop was a definitive death sentence to his life as he knew it. Furthermore, Judge Prescott's voice rose, striking like a blacksmith's hammer. Under the provisions of the federal asset forfeiture statutes, and in conjunction with the civil judgments already filed against you by the victims in this courtroom, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of all your personal assets. Your home, your vehicles, and your bank accounts are hereby seized to provide restitution. Moreover, due to your felony convictions operating under the color of law, the State Pension Board has permanently revoked your law enforcement retirement benefits. You will serve your 2 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and upon your release, you will possess absolutely nothing. You are entirely stripped of your power, your wealth, and your freedom. Officers, take him." 2 massive United States Marshals stepped forward. They did not use the standard, polite escort procedures. They grabbed Cobb roughly by the shoulders, snapping heavy, double-locked steel handcuffs around his wrists, followed by a thick iron chain around his waist. Cobb finally broke, a loud, pathetic wail escaping his lips as they dragged him backward out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside a nightmare of his own making. Hard karma had not merely visited Derek Cobb, it had entirely consumed him. 2 years later, the true, lasting impact of that rainy night on Route 29 finally materialized in the highest echelon of American power. Inside the breathtaking, marble-columned sanctuary of the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C., Justice Harrison Sterling sat at the massive mahogany conference table. The 9 justices were gathered for their private conference, surrounded by towering bookshelves holding centuries of legal precedent. Before them was the docket for Garrison versus Fauquier County, the civil lawsuit brought forward by the Marine veteran whose life Cobb had nearly destroyed. The case had worked its way up through the appellate courts, fundamentally challenging the deeply entrenched doctrine of qualified immunity, the exact legal loophole that had allowed Cobb and thousands of bad actors like him to evade civil liability for decades. Justice Sterling had requested to author the majority opinion. For weeks, Sterling worked in his private chambers, his fountain pen scratching across thick parchment. He drew upon decades of constitutional scholarship, but he also drew upon the cold, visceral memory of standing in the rain, staring down the barrel of unchecked, prejudiced authority. He remembered the arrogant sneer on Cobb's face. He remembered the feeling of having his fundamental rights casually discarded by a man who believed the law did not apply to him. When the decision was finally published, it struck the American legal system like a seismic event. The 8-1 landmark ruling, authored by Justice Sterling, systematically dismantled the absolute protection of qualified immunity in cases of egregious constitutional violations. Citing the original intent of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, explicitly referencing 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, Sterling wrote a devastating critique of modern police impunity. The doctrine of qualified immunity was constructed to afford breathing room for law enforcement officials making reasonable, split-second judgments in ambiguous situations, Justice Sterling wrote in the defining paragraph of the historic opinion. It was never intended to serve as a titanium fortress for those who act with malicious intent, racial animus, or willful ignorance of clearly established constitutional boundaries. When an officer of the law steps outside the bounds of the Constitution to terrorize the citizenry, they strip themselves of the state's protection. To hold otherwise is to fundamentally surrender the rule of law to the whims of those who carry the state's weapons. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within hours of the Supreme Court publishing the ruling, municipal legal departments across the country panicked. Without the absolute shield of qualified immunity, cities and counties could no longer afford to employ officers with histories of excessive force or civil rights complaints. The financial liability became apocalyptic. In Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and countless rural counties like Fauquier, internal affairs divisions were forced to immediately terminate hundreds of problematic officers. Police unions, long accustomed to bullying their way out of accountability, suddenly found themselves defenseless against a flood of federal civil rights lawsuits. The bad cops could no longer hide. The predators were forcibly expelled from the ranks, terrified by the new legal reality that they could be held personally, financially, and criminally liable for their abuses. Justice Sterling had not just punished one racist cop, he had fundamentally rewired the entire mechanism of American justice, balancing the scales for millions of citizens who previously had no recourse. Months later, on a crisp, clear autumn evening, Harrison Sterling backed his pristine, silver 1968 Mercedes-Benz 280SL out of his D.C. garage. He navigated through the bustling city traffic, eventually merging onto the long, quiet stretch of U.S. Route 29. The sun was setting, painting the Virginia sky in brilliant strokes of gold and bruised purple. Harrison drove in comfortable silence, his hands resting easily at 10 and 2. He passed the exact overpass where Cobb had once hidden in the shadows. The spot was empty now. The darkness that had once haunted that stretch of highway had been forcefully excised. Derek Cobb was currently sitting in a 6x9 concrete cell at United States Penitentiary, Lee, a high-security facility in the Appalachian Mountains. He spent his days looking over his shoulder, a disgraced, terrifyingly vulnerable ex-cop trapped in a world filled with men he had once abused. His pension was gone. His home had been sold at auction to pay David Garrison's civil settlement. His name was a synonymous warning whispered in police academies regarding the catastrophic consequences of arrogance. Harrison Sterling accelerated slightly. the vintage German engine purring with mechanical perfection. He watched the miles roll by in the rear-view mirror. The road ahead was clear, illuminated by the bright, unyielding headlights of his vehicle. The law had worked. The system, though deeply flawed and often agonizingly slow, had finally bent toward justice. And as the Supreme Court justice drove onward into the peaceful evening, he knew with absolute certainty that the highway was infinitely safer tonight than it had been before. The collision between pure arrogance and unyielding authority leaves no room for survival for the corrupt. Derek Cobb's downfall was not merely a matter of bad luck. It was the inevitable, crushing consequence of a predatory mindset meeting the immovable wall of the Constitution. By attempting to exploit the vulnerable, Cobb inadvertently summoned the full, terrifying power of the federal justice system down upon his own head. Justice Sterling's quiet restraint proved more devastating than any shouted threat or physical altercation. In the end, the badge did not protect the abuser. It merely amplified his guilt. The true victory, however, extended far beyond a single courtroom. It rippled outward, rewriting the legal landscape and ensuring that those who hide behind the color of law to enact their own prejudices will eventually find themselves entirely defenseless before the blind, uncompromising hammer of justice.